Okay everyone, welcome back to our Chapter 9 lecture video. Chapter 9's lecture video will cover joints. Now a joint is any location where two bones come together. There will often be some type of connective tissue that can be found at our joints, and certain types of joints may even contain a cavity. Every joint in our body can be classified both structurally and functionally. A joint's structural classification indicates what type of connective tissue can be found at that joint, while a joint's functional classification defines the degree of movement that a joint will allow. And that is going to be the focus of this lecture video. So this is going to be part 1 of joints. So our focus in this first video is how, based on the structures present at the joint and the degree of movability of the joint, we can classify the joints that we find throughout our bodies. So we have just finished up the skeletal system, and we've talked a lot about articulations of where two bones might come together. And now, instead of focusing on the bones themselves, we're going to focus on the junction of two bones and the structures that can be found at that junction. So in this first video, we're going to discuss the different types of joints. We're going to learn how to classify joints both structurally and functionally. And in part 2 of our lecture video for joints, we're going to discuss the different types of movements that can be found at various joints. So before I jump into the different structural and functional classifications, I just want us all to be aware of the difference in definition of these two terms, tendons and ligaments. Now I've used these terms somewhat throughout my previous lecture videos, but I've never given a slide with these definitions on it, so now it is here. Tendons and ligaments are very similar structures, but they have a major difference. Tendons connect muscles to bones, while ligaments are going to connect bones to bones. So this is the main difference between these two structures. Now, in Chapter 9, we're mostly going to be looking at different types of ligaments, and we will not discuss muscles until Chapter 10. But Chapter 10 is right around the corner, so we will then start discussing tendons. So I just want us all to be aware that tendons connect muscles to bone, ligaments connect bone to bone. So I've already sort of described what a joint is, but this slide's going to take us in a little bit more detail. So not only is a joint a place where two or more bones come together, but it is also going to be considered a place where bone and cartilage come together, or even bone and teeth will come together. So while we might often think of the joints that can be found in the elbow and in the shoulder as major types of joints, there are actually a lot of other joints that can be found within the body as well. Each tooth is going to form its own joint between either the maxilla or the mandible. And the bones of our ribs are going to articulate with the costal cartilage, and those are going to form different types of joints. So while joints on the surface might not necessarily seem like a major part of our body, joints are so vital in allowing our bodies to produce useful movements. When muscles contract and pull on bone, that's only going to produce a movement because there is a joint where two bones have come together. So the major topic for this video is going to be how we classify joints. Now, as I've said before, joints can be classified both structurally and functionally. The structural classification of our joints refers to what is actually present at the joint. What can we find at the joint if we were to take that joint and cut it open? Our functional classification refers to how that joint functions. What is the degree of movement that comes from that joint? Certain joints are a lot more movable than others, and that's what these three words here are going to indicate. Some of these are referring to joints that have a lower degree of movement, and others are referring to joints that have a much greater degree of movement. So the functional classification is based solely on the degree of movement. We have joints that are completely immovable, we have joints that are slightly movable, and we have joints that are freely movable. And that's what each of these three words stand for. So a synarthrosis is a type of joint that is fully immovable. There is no movement permitted at these joints at all. An amphiarthrosis is a joint that provides a slight degree of movement, or moderate movability, while a diarthrosis is a joint that is freely movable. So these three words sum up the functional classification of our joints, and we will see these again on the next slide. But that's how we'll functionally classify a joint, is how much movability is allowed at that specific joint. Now we can also structurally classify our joints. The structural classification refers to what is at that joint. What type of tissues and what structures can be found. So with a structural classification, we look at two different criteria. We look for whether or not there is a joint cavity present, And we will also look at the different type of connective tissue that is found present at the joint. We will see that structurally we can also have three major types of joints. We can have fibrous joints, we can have cartilaginous joints, and we can have synovial joints. Each of these types of joints is going to have some type of connective tissue and also may or may not have a joint cavity, and that's going to play into that joint's structural classification. So on the next slide, we're going to discuss the functional classification, and then we'll take our way into the structural classification of joints. So on this slide, we see our functional classification. Functional classification is based on the degree of movement allowed at the joint. How movable is our joint? So our functional classifications are synarthroses, amphiarthroses, and diarthroses. These are our three functional classifications. And these words just refer to different degrees of movement that can be allowed at certain joints. So a synarthrosis is going to allow no movement. These types of joints are going to be completely immovable. So a place that we will often see synarthroses is in the sutures that can be found on the skull. There's no movement that's allowed between the skull bones at the sutures. We'll also have this new word here known as a gomphosis. A gomphosis refers to the joint between tooth and bone. And so this is also going to be an immovable type of joint. So we'll classify these as synarthroses. Amphiarthroses are going to allow little to slight movement. So a moderate degree of movement is what an amphiarthrosis refers to. So these joints are not totally immovable, but they're also not very flexible either. So the places that we will most commonly see our amphiarthroses are in the intervertebral discs. As we should be able to remember, the intervertebral discs are plates of fibrocartilage that can be found between each of our vertebrae bones. Each of these joints is going to allow a moderate degree of movement. Remember, the intervertebral discs are supporting the spinal column, so we don't want these to be able to wiggle around freely and not offer the body the support that they do. And we'll also find an amphiarthrosis in the pubic symphysis, which can be found connecting our two coxal bones. These are two locations in the body where we will find amphiarthrotic joints. Our last functional classification is our diarthrotic joints, or the diarthroses. These joints are freely movable, and we see a lot of these joints found spread throughout the body. So these are the joints that can be found in the hips, in the knees, in the elbows, in the shoulders. Joints such as the one found at the elbow is a very, very movable joint. And when we combine the movability of the joint at the elbow with the movability of the joint at the shoulder, we have a lot of variability in the movements that we can make. And that will be the focus of our second half of the joint presentation. So synarthroses are immovable joints, amphiarthroses are slightly movable joints, and diarthroses are freely movable joints. Each joint in our body is going to get its own functional classification, and each joint in our body is going to get its own structural classification as well. So the structural classification is a little bit more involved than the functional classification is. So this is going to be one of your big slides that I want you to study on this presentation. This is your big slide that has a lot of the information that you will need to understand how we classify joints. So let's dive into these different types. I mentioned a few slides ago that we have fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints as three types of structural classifications that we can give to the joints we can find in our bodies. Now, if you can also remember from a few slides ago, a joint structural classification is actually based on two criteria. The first criteria is the presence of a joint cavity, which can also be called the synovial cavity. And the second criteria is going to be the different types of connective tissue that we can find involved in the joint. So is there or is there not a cavity, and what type of connective tissue do we see? Those two criteria are how we classify joints structurally. So I've put this information at the top of each of these joints. Fibrous joints will not have a synovial cavity, and they're going to be held together by dense, irregular connective tissue. Cartilaginous joints will also not have a synovial cavity. However, these joints will be held together by cartilage. So this one should be fairly easy to remember. And our synovial joints are going to be the only type of joints that do have a joint cavity. And again, we can call this the synovial cavity, and this is where we get its name. Now, synovial joints will have a synovial cavity, which will help to distinguish them from both cartilaginous and fibrous joints. However, synovial joints are also held together by dense irregular connective tissue, just like our fibrous joints were. Now, one other piece of information about synovial joints is that all synovial joints are diarthrotic joints, and all diarthrotic joints are synovial joints. So those will always go together. So that leaves our fibrous joints and our cartilaginous joints to be either synarthrotic or amphiarthrotic. So there are three types of fibrous joints. All will not have a synovial cavity, and all will be held together by dense irregular connective tissue. The first type are sutures, the second type are syndesmoses, and the third type are interosseous membranes. Now, sutures we will see on the skull, and only on the skull. Those are the only places that we will see sutures. And again, these are held together by a dense layer of fibrous irregular connective tissue. We also saw dense irregular connective tissue in the skin. Dense irregular connective tissue has an irregular fiber arrangement that allows for strength in many directions. So this is our first type of fibrous joint. We'll also see a syndesmoses, which are very similar to sutures. However, they're just going to have a little bit more dense irregular connective tissue than the suture will. So an example of a syndesmosis is a gomphosis, which is that joint that can be found between tooth and bone. And lastly, we will have interosseous membranes. Interosseous membranes can be found in two places in the body. We find these between the radius and the ulna, and between the tibia and the fibula. Now, down here it only says radius and ulna, but I would also like you to know that this can be found between the tibia and the fibula, and that will be also posted on a later slide. So interosseous membranes are sheets of this dense irregular connective tissue, and they form a connection between these two bones which helps to keep them together. So these are our three types of fibrous joints. Now, cartilaginous joints, again, as implied by the name, are going to be held together by cartilage. However, these will also not have a synovial cavity. These will have no synovial cavity at all. And there's two major types of cartilaginous joints. We have the synchondroses, and we have symphyses. These are two major types of cartilaginous joints. Now, these two types of cartilaginous joints are classified based on the type of cartilage that can be found at the joint. So synchondroses will have hyaline cartilage found at the joint, and symphyses will have fibrocartilage that can be found at the joint. So all the places in the body that have fibrocartilage, namely the intervertebral discs and the pubic symphysis, will be considered symphyses, and all of the places that have hyaline cartilage in our bodies will be considered synchondroses. Symphyses in general are going to allow a little bit more movement than synchondroses will, so we'll more often see these being amphiarthrotic. Now, our last type of joint is the synovial joint. Synovial joints are the only type that have a synovial cavity. So if you see a synovial cavity, you automatically know what type of joint we're looking at. Now, these types of joints will also have this dense irregular connective tissue, just like our fibrous joints will. So this is going to allow strength in many directions. One of the most common places that we find synovial joints is between two long bones. If you think back to the structure of the long bones, each long bone is going to have a layer of articular cartilage found on the outside. And that articular cartilage was functioning to protect the ends or the epiphyses of our long bones from grinding past one another. So we have to essentially wrap up this joint in this dense irregular connective tissue, and that's what's going to keep these two bones together. So we're going to specifically take a few minutes to go over the structure of synovial joints. So these are our three structural classifications for joints. We're going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So fibrous joints are named because they have that dense fibrous irregular connective tissue. Every time we try to structurally classify joints, we need to be thinking about our two criteria. Is there or is there not a synovial cavity? And what type of connective tissue is playing a role in keeping this joint together? So fibrous joints will not have a synovial cavity, and they'll be held together by that dense irregular connective tissue. Fibrous joints can either be synarthrotic or amphiarthrotic. We'll see sutures as an example of fibrous joints that permit no movement. So sutures are considered synarthrotic. Interosseous membranes, on the other hand, that can be found between the radius and the ulna and the tibia and the fibula are going to provide a little bit more movement. We're going to have a little bit more variability at that joint. And our main example of a syndesmosis is a gomphosis, which is going to be another type of synarthrotic joint, which has no movement. So again, every specific type of joint is going to get a functional classification and a structural classification. If you'd like another perspective on fibrous joints, I've posted a video link for you here that will also take you to a YouTube video that will discuss the structure of fibrous joints. Now, sutures is one of our best examples of a fibrous joint. This is going to have different ligaments that are made up of this dense, irregular connective tissue, and we're not going to have a joint cavity found at our sutures. Now, in early life, our sutures are actually going to be a little bit more amphiarthrotic than they are synarthrotic, because our skull bones have not fully fused together. But in the adult, those bones will be fully fused together, and there's not going to be any movement allowed. So they will, in later life, be classified as synarthrotic joints. I just want to take a second to introduce another word for you here, which is a synostosis. A synostosis refers to a suture that is fully replaced by bone, and therefore is no longer considered a joint in later life. A good example of the synostosis is what's referred to as the frontal suture. So, in early life, we actually had two frontal bones, one on each side. But the frontal bone specifically gets fused together, and that leaves us with one frontal bone. So that suture would be referring to a synostosis because it fused in later life. And there's no dense irregular connective tissue that can be found at what was that suture. On the right, we'll see a gomphosis, which is our example of a syndesmosis. Now, syndesmoses are just going to have a little bit more connective tissue than our sutures will. So naturally, with a little bit more connective tissue, these will be a little bit more movable than our sutures will. However, these joints are still considered synarthrotic. There is not a lot of movement that is allowed at this joint. Gomphoses are joints that sort of represent a nail and socket. So it's almost as if this tooth has been driven into the bone, into this socket. And there's different ligaments that can be found keeping the tooth in place. Now, between the tibia and the fibula, you can see that this is the interosseous membrane. This layer of connective tissue forms a long sheet, which represents a membrane. So you can imagine that because we have a little bit more connective tissue, that this joint's going to be a little bit more movable than our gomphoses will. Now we also have the anterior tibiofibular ligament that's found connecting both the tibia to the fibula. This is an example of another syndesmosis, because this ligament is going to have a little bit more connective tissue than we'll find in our sutures. So in review, if we're going to merge our structural and functional classifications of our joints, that's what we'll see on this slide. So the structural classification is a suture. We're going to look at the suture first. Sutures will have dense irregular connective tissue holding them together, and they'll also have no joint cavity. Sutures are only found between bones of the skull. So the head is the only place that we'll find sutures on the body. Some of these sutures can be replaced by synostoses, which essentially is where sutures fuse to form one bone. Now the functional classification of sutures depends on what stage of life that we are in. In the adult, these are synarthrotic joints. These will not move at all in the adult because these bones are going to be held together very, very tightly. However, in children, the bones of the skull are still fusing together. So in kids, these are actually going to be amphiarthrotic joints because these bones have not fully fused. So we'll see this making up the coronal suture, we'll see this in the sagittal suture, the lambdoidal suture, and so forth. And our one example of a synostosis is going to be the frontal suture. So our next type of fibrous joint is going to be a syndesmosis. This is going to have a little bit more connective tissue than a suture will. Oftentimes we'll see a ligament actually holding this joint together. These joints tend to be a little bit more movable than the sutures are. And a good example of this is the distal tibiofibular joint, which I showed you a few slides ago. And lastly, for fibrous joints, we'll have our interosseous membranes, which are going to be sheets of dense irregular connective tissue that can be found either between the tibia and the fibula and the radius and the ulna. So both pairs of bones are going to have an interosseous membrane. We'll find one of these in the forearm as well as in the lower leg. And these joints are also going to be slightly movable. These will be amphiarthrotic joints. Now that will take us into our cartilaginous joints. So cartilaginous joints, in review, are also going to lack a synovial cavity. These will have no joint cavity found at this joint. And there's two major types of cartilaginous joints. We have synchondroses and we have symphyses. Again, cartilaginous joints are held together by cartilage. You always want to look at the type of connective tissue and the presence of a joint cavity. So synchondroses are held together by hyaline cartilage, which is our most common type of cartilage that we have in our bodies, and symphyses are going to be held together by a layer of fibrocartilage. Now we have a bonus one here. This is the epiphyseal cartilage. So remember, the epiphyseal line that we find in our long bones is also going to be a structure that holds two bones together with some cartilage. That being said, this is not truly classified as a joint. So I just wanted to take a quick second to mention the epiphyseal cartilage, as it is a place in the body that's going to be bound by some type of cartilage. Now our cartilaginous joints are either going to be synarthrotic or amphiarthrotic. So that's where we get the idea that all synovial joints are going to be diarthrotic and all diarthrotic joints are going to be synovial joints. So again, if you'd like another exposure, I have a YouTube video for cartilaginous joints posted here. So here are some examples of our cartilaginous joints. So synchondroses are going to be held together by hyaline cartilage, and we'll see these between the manubrium of the sternum and the first rib. All of these are going to be synchondroses. These are joints that are held together by hyaline cartilage. This is a hyaline cartilage that makes up the costal cartilage. So this is our example of a synchondrosis. Now symphyses are going to be held together by fibrocartilage. And again, if you can remember where fibrocartilage can be found, you'll automatically know which joints are going to be considered symphyses. Now I really appreciate this joint, the pubic symphysis, because this is already telling you what type of joint we're looking at. This is a symphysis. That's what this is. This is held together by fibrocartilage. And we'll also have symphyses that are found between each vertebrae. So those are going to be our symphyses that are held together by fibrocartilage. Now again, the epiphyseal cartilage is not truly considered a joint. There really is no movement allowed at the epiphyseal growth plate. However, this is a location where cartilage can be found between two bones. So merging our structural and functional classification of cartilaginous joints can be seen on this slide. So again, with cartilaginous joints, the first question you want to ask is which type of cartilage are we looking at? Are we looking at a synchondrosis or are we looking at a symphysis? Is this going to be hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage? So synchondroses will always have hyaline cartilage. These joints can be either amphiarthrotic or synarthrotic. And we see these at the costal cartilages. Symphyses are made up of fibrocartilage. A nice disc of fibrocartilage is going to be connecting our bone. Symphyses will most of the time be amphiarthrotic. Symphyses need to be able to move around a little bit. And the intervertebral disc is a great example of this. Each joint between two vertebrae gives us a little bit of movement, and that little bit of movement adds up as we go down the spinal column, and this gives us a little bit more variability in how we can move those joints. And lastly is the epiphyseal cartilage. This is containing hyaline cartilage, but this would be synarthrotic because there is no movement allowed at this location at all. So our last types of joints are the synovial joints. Synovial joints will all have a synovial joint cavity and be held together by dense irregular connective tissue. But those are not the only things that can be found at synovial joints. We'll also find articular cartilage at our synovial joints as well. Synovial joints are often locations where two long bones come together, and that's going to provide us a lot of movement. So dense irregular connective tissue in the form of ligaments are going to be holding these bones together. Now, at every synovial joint will have a synovial cavity, and every synovial cavity has a very, very specific structure. Inside of the synovial cavity will have synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is going to help to lubricate the joint so that our bones can very, very nicely slide past one another. There's a lot of movement that can be found at synovial joints. Like I said, all of these are considered diarthrotic joints. We'll have a blood and nerve supply, and we'll also see an articular capsule that can be found at each of these synovial joints. So this slide will characterize the structure of synovial joints. So let's take a second to go over the individual structures that we see. So right here we can see two long bones. These are two epiphyses of our long bones that have come together to meet to form a joint. Now let's remember, each long bone is going to have this nice layer of articular cartilage that can be found at the ends. So when two long bones come together, there's going to be a layer of articular cartilage on one bone that rubs past articular cartilage on the other. The articular cartilage is going to be sort of in the same plane as our synovial membrane. The synovial membrane is highlighted in red. This is a discontinuous membrane that wraps around our entire synovial joint cavity. And the synovial membrane is what's secreting the synovial fluid. So this space in yellow showed here is the synovial cavity that's containing the synovial fluid. Now a little side note that I have regarding the synovial fluid goes back to my time when I had my own cadaver assigned to me in my gross anatomy lab. I was fortunate enough to be assigned to a cadaver for the course of the semester, and I was privileged with the opportunity to dissect different parts of this body to see what these structures looked like. Now, while I was dissecting the knee of my cadaver, it's safe to say that my dissecting skills needed a little bit of work, because my unsteady hand accidentally popped the synovial cavity of the knee, and the synovial fluid leaked out all over my gloves. Fortunately, I was wearing gloves. But the lesson that I learned from that is that synovial fluid is very, very slippery, and I was able to feel how slippery that synovial fluid was on my gloves. So that's just a validating experience to show us how lubricative our synovial fluid is. If these joints are constantly rubbing past one another, we need to have a lot of lubricant to allow them to slide past one another. Now we know from the structure of the long bone that the outside of our long bones are wrapped in what is known as periosteum. The periosteum is going to be somewhat continue with the fibrous membrane of the articular capsule. So the articular capsule is wrapping around this entire joint. The articular capsule is made up of the fibrous membrane that wraps around our synovial joints, and this fibrous membrane is going to be continuous with the periosteum, and the synovial membrane that can be found on the inside. So the synovial membrane and the fibrous membrane together make up the articular capsule. So we can also see these structures over here on an actual specimen. You can see that we have our spongy bone found here in the epiphysis of our long bones. And this is going to meet with our articular cartilage on either of these bones. And you can see there's this very, very slim synovial cavity that can be found in here containing synovial fluid. We'll see the synovial membrane and the fibrous membrane that's making up the articular capsule. So this is what's going on at the ends of long bones. When we take two long bones and stick them together, this is what we will see at their point of connection. So this is the structure of a synovial joint. Now I just want to draw a little distinction here between bursae and tendon sheaths. Both of these are structures that contain synovial fluid, but their arrangement and shape is a little bit different. Bursae are sac-like structures. They're essentially bags that are filled up with synovial fluid, and they'll help to cushion certain joints that get a lot of traffic. Tendon sheaths, on the other hand, are sort of elongated bursa, so they are sort of shaped like a tube, and I have a picture of a tendon sheath at the end of this presentation. Tendon sheaths are given their name because they will wrap around elongated tendons, and they will help to reduce friction and allow for sliding, as our muscles are constantly pulling on tendons. So some tendons, especially in the forearm, are going to be very, very long cord-like structures that stretch for a great distance. And around those we'll wrap this tendon sheath, and that's going to allow for protection of the tendon. So both of these are structures that contain synovial fluid and cushion different parts of our bodies. Bursae are going to be sac-like structures, and tendon sheaths are going to be tube-like structures. The only difference is in how these two are shaped. So here I've just posted this slide for our structural classification of joints. As I said, these tend to be a little bit more involved than our functional classifications are. I'm just going to take another quick second to go over these. Fibrous joints are not going to have a synovial cavity, and they're going to be held together by dense, irregular connective tissue. We have three types: sutures, syndesmoses, and interosseous membranes. Syndesmoses are often going to be ligaments that have a little bit more connective tissue than sutures will, and sutures will only be found in the skull. Interosseous membranes are found between both the radius and the ulna, as well as the tibia and the fibula. These form sheets of connective tissue that connect these two bones in our amphiarthrotic joints. Cartilaginous joints are not going to have a synovial cavity, and they will be held together by different types of cartilage. And the different type of cartilage that's found at the joint is going to indicate which type of joint we're looking at. So synchondroses are going to be held together by hyaline cartilage, and symphyses will be held together by fibrocartilage. And neither of these types of joints will have a synovial cavity. Lastly, our synovial joints are going to have a synovial cavity. They'll be the one type that does. And these are going to be held together by dense, irregular connective tissue, which is the same type of connective tissue found in fibrous joints. Every synovial joint is going to have a very similar structure containing articular cartilage, an articular capsule with a fibrous membrane and a synovial membrane, and the synovial membrane is going to secrete synovial fluid that will sit in the synovial cavity. That fibrous membrane will be continuous with the periosteum of those long bones, and we're going to form a nice little capsule around our synovial cavity to keep that synovial fluid in and to allow for the lubrication of our movements when we're moving our bones. All synovial joints are going to be diarthrotic joints, and all diarthrotic joints are going to be synovial joints. So fibrous and cartilaginous joints will either be synarthrotic or amphiarthrotic joints. We see synovial joints are the joints that allow the most movement, so the shoulder and the elbow. Those are two synovial joints that have a lot of movement permitted at them. So make sure you take some time to go over the structural and functional classifications of joints, as this is going to be a big chunk of Chapter 9. This slide will conclude Part 1 of our Chapter 9 lecture video on joints, and we'll continue with Part 2 where we'll discuss the different types of movements that can be found at synovial joints.